My husband brought his mistress to my birthday party and acted like I didn't exist, like I was just another shadow in a room I paid for in every sense that mattered. He walked in holding her hand, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, while the candles on my cake were still burning for me. No one said my name when they saw them together, no one moved toward me, no one even pretended this was strange. My voice caught in my throat when I said, "Jason, what is this?" And he didn't even fully look at me, just sighed like I was interrupting something important. His mistress smiled softly at me like I was a misunderstanding that needed to disappear, and everyone at the table watched me sit there in silence like I had already left the room long before I stood up. I should have known that night was not just betrayal, it was preparation for something I didn't yet understand. The way they looked away from me wasn't accidental, it was practiced, like I had already been erased in conversations I was never invited to hear. And then Jason said the words that turned my birthday into something I would never recover from. He said, "Don't make this bigger than it is, Emily," like I was the problem for noticing I was being replaced. If this story speaks to your heart, please take a moment to like and subscribe, not because I need it, but because stories like this deserve to be heard, and I would genuinely love to know where in the world you are watching from, what city or country, and what time it is where you are right now as you listen to this unfold. Only if this truly resonates with you, leave that in the comments, because sometimes it helps to know someone somewhere understands. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 32 years old, and I live in New York City on the Upper East Side. And what happened on my birthday that night didn't just change my relationship, it changed the way I understood my entire life. I always thought betrayal would look loud, dramatic, obvious, but what I experienced was quiet, polite, almost socially acceptable in the way it unfolded in front of witnesses who refused to call it what it was. Jason and I had been married for 6 years, long enough for people to stop asking if we were happy and start assuming we simply were. That night, we were supposed to be celebrating at a rooftop restaurant overlooking Manhattan, the kind of place where glass walls reflect city lights like a second sky. But instead I found myself sitting at the edge of a table that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. Jason arrived late, adjusting his cufflinks like nothing in the world could possibly be urgent enough to interrupt him, and Brianna Cole walked beside him as if she had always been there. Jason didn't introduce her as a mistake or a complication. He introduced her as if she had always been part of the plan, saying softly, "This is Brianna. She's important to me." And in that moment I realized importance was not something I held in his world anymore. Brianna's voice was calm when she sat across from me and said, "It's so nice to finally meet you, Emily," like we were being introduced at a dinner party and not standing in the ruins of a marriage. I remember laughing once, not because anything was funny, but because my mind couldn't process how easily I had been repositioned in a room I organized. One of Jason's business friends leaned slightly toward another and asked in a low voice, "Wait, are they separated?" And no one corrected him, not even Jason. I remember touching the stem of my wine glass just to feel something real, because everything else felt like it had been staged without my permission. Jason leaned toward me briefly and said, "You don't have to make this uncomfortable." And I remember thinking how strange it was that my existence had become the inconvenience. But what no one at that table knew, what Jason didn't know, what Brianna didn't even have the awareness to imagine, was that I had spent years being invisible in rooms just like this long before I ever met him. Learning how to observe people who underestimate you is a skill you don't forget. And Jason used to laugh with me about that, back when he still needed me, back when he still asked me to review his deals before he walked into meetings he wasn't ready for. Somewhere between then and now, I became something he thought he could discard without consequence. That night, while everyone continued eating like nothing was breaking, I excused myself and walked toward the edge of the rooftop where the wind was colder, sharper, cutting through the noise behind me, and I told myself to stay calm, to stay composed, because reacting was something they expected, but silence was something else entirely. I remember checking my phone, not because I expected anything, but because I needed to feel distance from that table, from those eyes, from the version of myself they were rewriting in real time. That's when I saw it, a missed notification from an unknown number marked urgent, and underneath it, a second message from the building concierge saying, "A legal representative requested immediate delivery for you, downstairs waiting." I frowned because I hadn't called any lawyer, I hadn't initiated anything, and Jason certainly hadn't either, not unless something had already been set in motion without me knowing. I looked back through the glass doors into the restaurant and saw Jason laughing slightly too loudly at something Brianna said, as if nothing in the world had changed, and yet I could feel something shifting, something I couldn't yet name but instinctively understood was no longer under my control, and just as I turned back toward the elevator, I saw a man in a dark suit step out of it holding a sealed ivory envelope with a gold insignia I recognized instantly from my father's estate, and he said, "Miss Carter, I've been instructed to deliver this only in your presence, and only if tonight was the night everything changed." The moment I saw the man in the dark suit holding that sealed envelope, everything inside me went still in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. Like my body understood before my mind agreed that this was not the beginning of something, but the continuation of something I had been living inside for years without naming it. And as I stood there on the edge of the rooftop glass doors reflecting the city lights behind me, I realized my hands were not shaking. They were simply remembering, because silence has a memory too, and mine had been trained for a long time. The lawyer did not rush. He did not smile. He simply held the envelope like it had weight beyond paper, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of restraint that comes from legal instruction rather than emotion, saying, "Miss Carter, I am instructed to deliver this only under verified presence conditions, and only if tonight represents a verified public relational rupture." Jason was still behind me somewhere in the restaurant, still performing a version of himself that no longer required me in it, and Brianna's laughter drifted faintly through the glass like something distant and rehearsed. But I did not turn back because something about that envelope had already pulled me inward, not forward inward, into places I had avoided visiting for years. I took it without speaking, and that is when it happened, not externally but internally, a fracture of memory sliding open like a drawer that had been locked but never emptied, and I was not standing on a rooftop in Manhattan anymore. I was sitting at a kitchen table in Boston years ago, watching Jason rehearse a pitch he could barely believe in while asking me, for the third time that week, to just look over the numbers again because you see things differently. And I did, because I always did, because that was the role I had learned to play long before anyone called it a role. Back then, Jason was not the man who brought someone else to my birthday. He was the man who could not get meetings without my notes rewritten into confidence, and I remember him once saying, almost laughing, "Emily, I think you make me sound smarter than I am." And I remember replying, "No, I just remove the noise." And I did not realize then that removing noise eventually includes removing yourself from the story. The lawyer stepped slightly aside, giving me space that felt less like courtesy and more like protocol, and I heard myself ask, "What is this really?" And he answered without hesitation, "It is your father's estate instruction, activated under conditions you were never meant to question until they occurred." And something in the phrasing of that sentence tightened inside me because my father had always spoken in systems, not sentiment. I could still hear him in fragments from childhood, not warm memories, but structured ones, lessons disguised as observations, like, "People reveal themselves when they think there is no consequence," or "Never assume silence means absence." And I used to think those were just things he said, not things he prepared me for. Jason and I had been together long enough that people stopped asking how we met, and started assuming we were stable, which is what New York City calls relationships that have not yet collapsed publicly. But what no one saw was how often I had already been disappearing in small increments, starting with invitations I was not included in, then meetings I was no longer asked to review, then conversations where my name was replaced with phrases like, "We should ask someone else," said gently, almost apologetically, as if erasure required politeness to be acceptable. There was a night, maybe 2 years ago, when I sat alone in our apartment in the Upper East Side while Jason was at a networking dinner he forgot to mention until an hour before it started, and I remember realizing I had not spoken to him meaningfully in almost 4 days, not because we were fighting, but because I had become someone whose input was no longer scheduled. When I asked him about it later, he looked confused in the way people do when they are not lying but also not fully present, and he said, "You have been busy too, right?" And I nodded because it was easier than explaining that my kind of busy still included remembering him. That was the first time I understood that exclusion does not always arrive as rejection. Sometimes it arrives as reorganization. The present returned in pieces, the envelope in my hand, the lawyer waiting, the city behind me continuing without interruption, and I realized I was not being asked to open it because of curiosity. I was being asked because witnesses mattered, because whatever was inside required presence, not privacy, and that meant this was not just family, this was structure, legal structure, the kind my father trusted more than conversation. I finally asked the question I had been avoiding since the rooftop doors opened, "Why now?" And the lawyer replied, "Because your father specified that truth delivered privately can be denied, but truth delivered publicly becomes irreversible." And I felt something shift at that word, irreversible, not fear exactly, but consequence. Jason's voice briefly cut through from behind me, closer now, sharper now, saying, "Emily, what is going on?" But I did not turn yet, because for the first time that night I understood that his confusion was not the center of this moment. It was only part of its timing, and I looked down at the envelope again, my name written in my father's handwriting, and I remembered something I had forgotten. I remembered that my father never left loose ends, only conditions waiting for activation, and as I began to lift the seal, I had the unsettling certainty that whatever was inside had already been shaping this night long before Jason ever walked in with someone else, and that realization landed just as the lawyer said quietly, almost like a warning that had already arrived too late, "Once you open that, Miss Carter, you will no longer be able to return to how any of them remember you." The moment the seal on the envelope broke, it did not feel like paper giving way. It felt like something older, something already waiting for my consent to become real. And I remember holding my breath without realizing it as the lawyer stood perfectly still beside me, not watching me like a man curious about a secret, but like a man witnessing a procedure he had been legally instructed to observe. And behind the glass doors I could still see the party continuing, laughter rising and falling like nothing in the world had changed. Except I knew now that something had already changed long before I touched this letter, something carefully positioned, like a trap that only becomes visible after it closes. Jason's voice came closer again, sharper this time, cutting through the rooftop air as he said, "Emily, stop standing there and tell me what that is." And there was a familiarity in his tone that no longer felt like marriage, but like ownership expecting compliance, and I finally turned slightly toward him, not fully, not yet, because I could feel the weight of the letter pulling my attention forward more than his presence pulling it back. Brianna was now visible through the glass, watching with the kind of polite curiosity people reserve for problems they assume will resolve themselves, and Jason stepped out onto the terrace with that controlled irritation he always used when something did not go according to his narrative, saying, "Whatever my father left you, it is probably nothing important. We can deal with it later." And that sentence, so casually dismissive, landed differently than anything he had said that night because it revealed something simple and devastating. He truly believed I had nothing left worth protecting. I opened the letter. The paper inside was heavier than I expected, not physically but structurally, as if every line had been written with the assumption that it would one day be read under scrutiny, and the first words were not emotional. They were procedural, stating my full name, stating my identity, stating verification conditions that made it clear this was not a message, this was an activation. Jason stepped closer, trying to read over my shoulder, saying, "This is ridiculous. Your father has been gone for years. What could he possibly?" But he stopped mid-sentence, not because I interrupted him, but because the first clause shifted the air between us, and I saw the exact moment his certainty began to fail. The letter referenced a trust structure I had never been told existed, not as inheritance in the simple sense people assume, but as conditional authority tied to public behavioral thresholds, and I felt my own mind slow down as I read the phrase, "public recognition of relational dissolution," because it meant my father had not been preparing wealth to be given quietly, he had been preparing truth to be released publicly, when denial was no longer possible. Jason let out a short laugh, but it was thinner than before, less confident, saying, "This does not mean anything, Emily. Your father cannot just control our lives from beyond the grave." And I looked up at him for the first time since opening the envelope. Really looked, not as a husband, but as a man reacting to something he could not categorize, and I said quietly, "It does not seem like he is controlling anything. It seems like he is confirming what you already chose." Brianna shifted behind him, her expression tightening slightly, because even she could feel the tone of the room changing, like gravity adjusting without permission, and Jason reached for the letter, not gently, not asking, just reaching, saying, "Give me that. This is nonsense. You are being manipulated." But the lawyer stepped forward for the first time, his voice calm but absolute as he said, "Sir, you are not authorized to handle that document." And Jason froze, not because he respected authority, but because he was suddenly realizing he was not the one being addressed. The letter continued in structured language that made emotion irrelevant, stating that certain financial instruments, advisory rights, and family trust positions were now contingent upon my verified presence and acknowledgement of current marital status under witnesses. And I understood then why the rooftop mattered, why the lawyer had insisted on presence, because this was not about secrecy, it was about irreversibility, about turning private truth into public record. Jason's composure began to fracture in small visible ways, the way he adjusted his cuff again without noticing, the way his eyes moved from me to the lawyer to the envelope and back again, searching for a version of this that still made him central, and he said, "You planned this." But his voice lacked conviction, and I answered honestly, "I did not plan anything. I think you simply never asked what was already in motion before you decided I did not matter." Brianna finally spoke, softer now, uncertain, asking Jason, "What is going on?" But he did not answer her immediately. Because for the first time that night, he did not have an answer that positioned him safely. The lawyer added quietly, "There is one more clause you need to understand." And the way he said it made even Jason stop speaking, and I turned another page in the letter, my fingers steady now in a way they had not been earlier, and I read the line that stated the trust did not activate upon death, but upon verified social erasure events witnessed by third parties, and I felt my chest tighten not with sadness, but with recognition, because my father had not been protecting me from betrayal, he had been measuring it, waiting for it, structuring for it. Jason's voice lowered, no longer performative, asking, "What does that even mean?" But I already understood, and I said it softly, almost to myself. "It means you did not just bring someone to my birthday. It means you confirmed something that was already being watched." And as I said that, I noticed something I had not noticed before. The rooftop was no longer just filled with guests eating and talking. There were pauses now, subtle attention shifts, people beginning to sense that the story they thought they were attending was no longer the one unfolding, and the lawyer closed his eyes briefly, then said the final instruction that made everything go still. Upon acknowledgement, the next phase of disclosure begins in full legal view of all present witnesses, and Jason finally looked at me the way people look when they realize they are no longer inside the narrative they believed they controlled. The rooftop had changed its temperature without the weather changing at all, and I realized it only after I noticed people were no longer pretending not to listen, because silence in a crowded place is never empty. It is always filled with attention that has shifted direction, and every movement now felt slower, heavier, as if the entire space had quietly understood that something irreversible had begun. Jason stood a few steps away from me, still trying to hold on to the shape of control, but his posture had already shifted in ways he did not seem aware of, shoulders tighter, gaze moving too quickly between my face and the lawyer holding the sealed folder, as if searching for a version of reality that would return to normal if he looked hard enough. Brianna no longer looked certain either, her earlier composure replaced with something thinner, less rehearsed, because whatever confidence she had walked in with did not include being part of a room that suddenly felt like it was waiting for instructions. The lawyer adjusted his cuff once, then spoke into a small discreet device clipped to his jacket, saying, "Witness presence confirmed," and those two words did not sound dramatic, but they landed like a lock, clicking into place. Jason stepped forward again, his voice sharper now, stripped of performance, saying, "This is ridiculous. You are all acting like this means something legal." And that was when the elevator behind us opened again. The sound was small at first, almost unnoticed, but then the movement of people subtly changed, because someone new had entered the space, someone who did not belong to the party, someone whose presence immediately redefined the room without saying a word. He was an older man, dressed in a dark tailored suit that did not try to impress, but instead suggested he did not need to, his hair silver at the temples, his posture calm in the way only people used to authority move when they are no longer required to prove it. And when his eyes landed on me, something in his expression changed instantly, not surprise, not curiosity, but recognition, deep and immediate. He stopped walking. The room did not notice at first, but I did, because I had seen that kind of pause before, the kind that happens when someone realizes they are standing in a moment they were trained to anticipate. He spoke my name slowly, carefully, like confirming a memory, saying, "Emily Carter." And the way he said it made Jason turn immediately, because Jason had never heard my full name sound like it belonged to anything important outside of our marriage. The man stepped forward, ignoring everyone else, and I heard Brianna quietly ask, "Who is that?" But no one answered her. The lawyer lowered his head slightly in acknowledgement, which was the first time I understood this man was not an interruption, but part of the structure. Jason finally spoke again, but his voice had changed, less confident, more uncertain, asking, "Do you know this man?" And before I could answer, the man did something that changed the entire temperature of the rooftop for the second time that night. He said, "I have reviewed her father's entire estate structure for over 10 years. And then he paused, looking directly at Jason, not with hostility, but with the calm detachment of someone observing a mistake that had already completed itself. Jason's expression tightened, and he said, "Estate structure? What are you talking about?" But the man did not respond to him immediately, instead turning slightly toward me and saying, "Your father expected this exact moment, not in detail but in principle." And I felt something inside me tighten because the way he spoke my father's name suggested history, not hearsay. The man then turned fully to Jason and added, "You are currently standing in a condition your social position cannot override." And that was the first time Jason looked unsettled in a way that was no longer dismissible. Brianna took a small step back, her confidence collapsing into uncertainty, and Jason finally snapped, saying, "I do not care who you are, this is a private matter." But the man replied calmly, "No, it is not private anymore. That is precisely the point." The lawyer opened the sealed folder further, revealing documents inside, but still not fully exposing them, as if the timing itself required structure, and the older man finally stepped closer to me, lowering his voice just slightly, saying, "I was present when your father established the final amendment," and then he added something that made the air feel thinner. He told me there would come a moment when people around you would confuse your silence for absence. Jason turned sharply toward me, his voice rising for the first time, saying, "What amendment?" But the man did not look at him anymore. Instead, he looked at me and said, "Your father did not leave you protection. He left you recognition." And I felt my throat tighten because that word, recognition, carried a weight I had not expected. Jason's composure finally cracked in visible fragments, his voice lower now but unstable, saying, "Emily, tell me what this is." But for the first time, I realized he was no longer asking as a husband. He was asking as someone who had lost his place in a system he did not know existed. The older man reached into his jacket and pulled out a second document, placing it into the lawyer's hands, and said, "You are authorized to proceed with full disclosure conditions." And the lawyer nodded once, slowly, before speaking in a voice that carried across the rooftop clearly enough for every guest to hear. "At this time, the estate recognizes Miss Carter as the primary authorized beneficiary under conditional activation, effective upon verified public dissolution of marital partnership witnessed tonight." And in that exact moment, I saw Jason stop breathing for a second, not physically but mentally, like something inside him had just been removed without warning, and the man who had entered the room late said quietly, almost as if speaking only to me, "I am sorry. Not for what was happening, but for how long it had taken for the truth to finally become visible." The rooftop no longer felt like a celebration space. It felt like a courtroom without walls, where every glance had become a silent testimony and every pause had become evidence, and I stood at the center of it all, feeling something I had not felt in years. Not fear, but exposure, like a curtain had been pulled back without my permission, and people were finally seeing a version of me that had always existed but was never allowed to surface. The older man who had entered the elevator now stood beside the lawyer, both of them positioned not as guests, but as operators of something structured far beyond the social setting around us, and Jason stood slightly apart from them, his face locked in a tension between disbelief and something closer to panic, as if he was trying to find the version of reality where he still had control over what was happening. Brianna had stopped speaking entirely, her earlier confidence reduced to stillness, and I noticed she was no longer looking at Jason with certainty, but with calculation, the kind people use when they realize the ground they are standing on may not belong to them. The lawyer continued reading from the document, his voice steady, procedural, almost detached, saying, "The estate confirms conditional activation of beneficiary status upon verified public dissolution of marital partnership, witnessed and documented in real time, And I understood then that this was not simply inheritance. This was classification, as if my life had already been indexed into conditions I had never been told I was part of. Jason finally laughed once, but it was hollow, forced, and he said, "This is absurd. Emily does not have any kind of estate authority. She is not involved in anything like this." And the older man turned his head slightly toward him, studying him in a way that felt almost clinical, before saying, "That statement is precisely why the conditions exist." There was a silence after that, not the kind of silence that comes from confusion, but the kind that comes from realization spreading unevenly through a room. I felt my fingers tighten slightly around the edge of the letter still in my hand, and I could feel something inside it continuing to unfold even though I had not yet reached the end of it, as if the document itself understood timing better than I did. Jason stepped closer to me, his voice lowering now, losing its public edge and becoming something more personal, more uncertain, saying, "Emily, stop this. Whatever game your father set up, it does not change anything between us." And for the first time that night, I heard something underneath his words that sounded like fear disguised as dismissal. I looked at him properly then, not as the man I married, but as the man who had decided I could be replaced without consequence, and I said quietly, "I am not the one changing anything." And that was the moment I felt the room shift again, because people understand tone before they understand meaning. The older man stepped slightly forward, addressing the room rather than Jason directly, and said, "For clarity, Miss Carter's father established a multi-layer trust structure governed by behavioral contingency clauses, which means authority is not inherited in silence. It is activated through witnessed truth." And I saw several guests subtly adjust their posture, not because they understood all of it, but because they understood enough to know they were now part of it. Brianna finally spoke again, her voice less certain, asking, "What does that mean for us?" But no one answered her immediately, because the answer was no longer social, it was structural. The lawyer turned another page, and this time I saw my name again in repeated legal references, not as emotional identity but as position, as if my existence had been formally documented in ways I had never been shown, and I felt something rise in my chest that was not surprise anymore, but recognition of a past I had been living without understanding its architecture. Jason ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew well, one he used when negotiations were slipping beyond his control, and he said, "Emily, you knew about this, but it was not really a question. It was an attempt to reassign responsibility back to me." And I answered honestly, "No, I knew I was always being evaluated, I just did not know by what system." The older man then looked directly at me again, and for the first time his voice softened slightly, not with emotion, but with acknowledgement, saying, "Your father did not trust assumption, he trusted observation, and he believed that people reveal their nature when they think there will be no consequence." And as he said that, I remembered small moments I had never given weight to, conversations my father ended abruptly when Jason entered a room, questions he never answered about Jason's intentions, quiet warnings disguised as casual remarks about structure and dependency. Jason suddenly said, louder now, "This is ridiculous. You are all acting like I have done something criminal." And the lawyer responded without raising his voice, "This is not about criminality. It is about confirmation of status change under agreed legal terms." And that phrase, status change, made the air feel heavier than before. I opened the letter further, finally reaching the section that had been partially hidden in earlier pages, and I read words that did not describe wealth, but described authority transfer conditions tied to relational truth exposure. And I realized then that my father had not been protecting me from betrayal, he had been documenting it as a threshold. Jason stepped back slightly, and for the first time he did not interrupt me, because whatever version of the story he had been telling himself was no longer keeping pace with what was unfolding in front of him. Brianna looked at him now with a faint uncertainty that had replaced her earlier composure, and I could see her beginning to understand that she had not entered a simple relationship conflict, she had entered a system she did not design. The older man finally said, almost quietly, "There is still one final acknowledgement required before full activation proceeds," and every eye on the rooftop subtly shifted again, not toward Jason, not toward Brianna, but toward me. And in that moment I understood something that made my breath slow instead of quicken, because whatever came next was not about what had been taken from me, but about what had been waiting all along for me to finally be seen. The rooftop felt different after the last words were spoken, not louder, not quieter, but reorganized, as if every person present had been quietly repositioned inside a structure they had not agreed to enter. And I could feel it most in the way Jason no longer looked at me with certainty, but with something closer to instability, like he was trying to locate the version of me he believed he understood and failing to find it in real time. The lawyer stood still beside the older man, and neither of them moved as though movement itself would disturb the legal weight already suspended in the air. And I noticed for the first time that even the guests were no longer pretending this was a private celebration, because privacy had already been replaced by documentation. The older man spoke again, his voice calm but absolute, saying, "The final acknowledgement is simple, Miss Carter. You confirm, in presence of witnesses, that the marital partnership you are legally bound to is no longer recognized in practice or intent." And for a moment the words did not feel emotional, they felt procedural, like signing your name on something that had already been decided elsewhere. Jason immediately stepped forward, his voice rising now, no longer controlled, saying, "No, this is insane. You cannot just declare a marriage like this, Emily. Tell them this is not real." And there it was, the first crack, not in the system, but in him. Brianna moved slightly behind him, her expression no longer confident but alert, like she was recalculating her position in a situation she had previously assumed was stable, and Jason turned toward her briefly as if expecting support, but she said nothing. The lawyer opened his folder further and replied calmly, "No declaration is being made. A condition is being verified." And that distinction landed differently, because verification does not ask permission. Jason laughed again, but it was shorter now, sharper at the edges, and he said, "You are all talking like she is some kind of authority figure. She is my wife." And I felt something inside me settle at that word, wife, because it no longer matched anything I recognized about my own position in that sentence. I finally spoke, not loudly, not emotionally, just clearly, and I said, "You have been calling me your wife while treating me like I stopped existing in the same role." And the words were not an accusation. They were an observation. Jason's face tightened, and he said, "That is not what is happening. You are making this dramatic because of one dinner." But even as he said it, his voice betrayed him, because he knew it was not one dinner, and so did I. The older man stepped forward slightly, and for the first time his gaze softened toward me instead of remaining purely procedural, and he said, "Miss Carter does not need to escalate anything. She only needs to confirm what has already been observed by multiple witnesses." And then he added, turning slightly toward Jason, "Your interpretation is no longer relevant to the condition being evaluated." That sentence changed something in Jason's posture immediately, because it removed him from the center of the situation without confrontation, and I could see him struggling to recover his place in a conversation that was no longer organized around his perspective. Brianna finally spoke again, quietly, almost cautiously, asking, "What exactly is being evaluated?" And no one answered her directly, because she was not the subject of the system, she was only adjacent to it. The lawyer turned a page and said, "Repeated documented instances of social displacement, verified presence of third-party relational replacement, and acknowledgement of exclusion in public setting," and I realized then that what I had felt as emotional abandonment had been recorded as structured evidence. Jason shook his head, stepping back slightly, saying, "This is ridiculous. You are turning personal problems into legal fiction," and for the first time I did not feel the need to defend myself, because I was no longer being interpreted emotionally, I was being processed structurally. I looked at him and said calmly, "I am not turning anything into anything. I am simply present for what you already did in front of witnesses." And that was when the room shifted again, because truth spoken without anger is harder to dismiss. The older man nodded once, then said, "Proceed," and the lawyer lifted the final section of the document. Jason's voice changed immediately, losing its earlier sharpness and becoming more fractured as he said, "Emily, you are letting them do this. You are letting them rewrite everything we built." And I answered him without raising my voice. "What we built does not require rewriting. It required recognition, and you stopped providing it long before tonight." That sentence hit differently, because it was not about betrayal, it was about absence. Brianna looked at Jason now, not with certainty or alignment, but with something closer to reassessment, and I could see the moment she began to understand she was not stepping into stability, she was stepping into transition. The lawyer then said, Final acknowledgement is required from Miss Carter to activate full legal standing under Clause 7, and every sound on the rooftop seemed to lower itself instinctively, as if the entire environment understood it was no longer watching a personal conflict, but a structural shift. Jason spoke one more time, but it was no longer confident, saying, "Do not do this." And I looked at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, and I said, "I am not doing anything. I am acknowledging what has already been true longer than you were willing to see it." And in that moment I understood the difference between reaction and recognition. The older man lowered his head slightly, as if confirming alignment with something unseen, and said quietly, "Then the condition is fulfilled," and the lawyer closed the folder with a sound that was not loud, but final, and I felt the space around me change again, not emotionally, but structurally, like something that had been waiting beneath the surface of my life had finally been allowed to rise. The silence that followed the closing of the folder was not empty. It was reorganized into something far more dangerous, because now everyone in the space understood that what had been happening was no longer interpretation or assumption, it was verification, and I could feel it in the way conversations around the rooftop did not resume, in the way glasses stayed half lifted, in the way people stopped pretending they were only guests at a birthday dinner and began behaving like witnesses at something they had not been warned to observe. Jason stood at the center of it all, but for the first time he did not feel central at all, because the room no longer responded to him, it responded around him, and that shift alone was enough to destabilize the certainty he had carried into this night. The older man remained still, watching without interference, while the lawyer held the closed folder like a conclusion rather than an object, and I noticed something subtle begin to happen among Jason's closest friends at the table, the ones who had laughed earlier, the ones who had stayed quiet when silence was easier than correction. One of them, a man in a gray suit who had been drinking slowly throughout the evening, leaned toward another and said under his breath, "Did you know about this?" And the other replied immediately, "No, I thought this was just a relationship thing." But neither of them sounded convinced anymore. Brianna shifted in her seat, her confidence now replaced by something sharper, and she looked at Jason directly for the first time since everything began to change, asking quietly, "What did you tell me this was?" And that question alone created a fracture that Jason did not anticipate because it moved the problem away from Emily and placed it directly between them. Jason turned toward her quickly, too quickly, saying, "This has nothing to do with you, stay out of it." But the tone carried panic disguised as control, and Brianna did not accept it the way she had earlier in the night. She responded, her voice lower but clearer, "You told me she was already out of your life, and that sentence did not require proof, because it only required contradiction." The older man finally spoke again, not to intervene, but to observe aloud, saying, "This is the predictable phase," and Jason snapped his attention toward him, asking, "What phase?" But the man did not answer directly, because he was no longer addressing Jason as a participant, only as a variable inside a completed system. Around us, I began to notice something else, smaller but more revealing. People were no longer watching me with confusion. They were watching Jason with recalculation, and that shift was not emotional, it was social mathematics. One of Jason's investors, a man who had been silent the entire evening, stood slightly from his chair and said, "Jason, you never mentioned any of this." And Jason immediately responded, "Because there is nothing to mention." But his voice lacked stability, and that was enough for doubt to begin spreading. The lawyer reopened the folder again, not for drama but for sequence, and said, "For clarity, multiple parties present here tonight were listed as indirect witnesses under a state clause activation protocol, and suddenly I understood why the guest list had never felt random, why certain people had been invited, why others had not, because this was not a gathering, it was a controlled environment for confirmation." Jason looked around the table now, really looked, and for the first time he seemed to realize that the people he assumed were on his side were not aligned to him at all, they were aligned to the situation. Brianna stood up slightly, her chair scraping softly, and said, "I did not sign up for this," and Jason turned toward her sharply, saying, "You think I did." And that was the moment the collapse began to accelerate, because blame entered the space, and immediately needed direction. One of Jason's friends muttered, "This is going to damage everything," and Jason responded without thinking, "No, it is not. This is being staged." But no one agreed, and that silence was heavier than disagreement. The older man finally stepped forward just slightly, addressing the table as a whole, saying, "Nothing here is being staged. The only thing that has changed is visibility," and that word, visibility, landed differently than anything else that night because it removed illusion without creating confrontation. Jason turned back toward me again, and now his voice was no longer controlled at all, saying, "Emily, you need to stop this. Tell them this is not who you are," and I felt something settle inside me at that sentence because it revealed the final misunderstanding he had carried all along, that I was something he could define in front of other people. I answered him quietly, without raising my voice. "I am not doing anything to you, Jason. I am simply standing in the version of reality you did not include me in." And that line did not provoke argument, it provoked silence. Brianna looked between us now, and for the first time she did not look like a participant in a love triangle. She looked like someone realizing she had been inserted into a structure she did not design, and she said softly, almost to herself, "You said she did not matter." And Jason immediately replied, "She did not." But even as he said it, he understood it was no longer credible. The investor stood again, this time fully, and said, "If this is tied to estate control or verified legal authority, then we were never properly briefed." And Jason turned toward him, trying to regain authority, saying, "There is no authority here," but the lawyer interrupted calmly. "There is documentation, witnesses, and activation conditions," and the investor did not sit back down. Instead, he looked at Jason and said, "Then why were we not informed?" And that question was the beginning of the final break, because it was no longer about me. It was about Jason's credibility in every room beyond this one. The older man looked at me briefly and said, "This is the moment your father prepared for." And I realized then that I was not being elevated. I was being revealed, and the people who once defined me by absence were now being forced to account for presence, while Jason stood in the middle of a room that had stopped agreeing with him. The rooftop no longer felt like a place where something was happening to me. It felt like a place where something had already finished happening, and I only remained there long enough to understand its shape, as the voices around me slowly stopped trying to control the narrative and instead began trying to understand their own position inside it, while I stood still in a way that no longer felt like survival, but like distance. Jason was speaking again, but his words no longer reached the same authority they had carried at the beginning of the night, because every sentence he tried to build now collapsed under the weight of what had already been confirmed, and I could see it in the way he kept glancing at the lawyer, then at the older man, then back at me, as if searching for a version of me that would still respond to pressure instead of truth. Brianna had stopped performing entirely, her posture no longer confident, no longer aligned, and she had stepped slightly away from Jason without even realizing it, like her body had already made a decision her voice had not caught up with yet. The lawyer closed his folder with a sound that was softer than it should have been, but somehow final anyway, and said, "All activation conditions have been formally acknowledged under witness protocol," and for the first time that night, no one argued with language, because language was no longer something Jason could control. The older man turned slightly toward me, not as an observer anymore, but as someone completing a responsibility, and he said, "Your father specified that once this threshold was reached, you were not to remain in environments defined by conflict exposure," and I felt the words land differently than everything before, because they were not about inheritance or legality or status, they were about removal. Jason immediately responded, his voice lower now, stripped of earlier aggression, replaced by something closer to desperation, saying, "Emily, do not do this, do not walk away from us because of what they are saying." But the way he said us no longer matched anything I recognized as us. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I did not feel pulled toward explaining, defending, or correcting. I only felt clarity, and I said quietly, "There is no version of us that existed in the same place at the same time for a long while now. You just said it out loud tonight." That sentence did not provoke a response, it removed one. Brianna looked at Jason now with a silence that was no longer emotional, but observational, and I could see her beginning to understand that she had not replaced me in a relationship. She had entered a structure that was already dissolving before she arrived. The investor who had spoken earlier stood again, this time addressing the lawyer instead of Jason, asking, "What happens after activation is confirmed?" And the lawyer answered calmly, "Authority transitions to Miss Carter, under predefined estate governance terms, and all dependent relational structures are subject to reclassification review. And I noticed how quickly people began to understand that nothing about this remained personal in their minds anymore, because legality removes sentiment faster than confrontation ever could. Jason stepped forward one last time, but it was different now, slower, less certain, and he said, "Emily, you are not going to leave this room like this, not without talking to me." And I felt something inside me shift not toward him, but away from the need to remain inside the same emotional gravity. I answered softly, "I am not leaving because of tonight. I am leaving because tonight simply confirmed what I stopped belonging to a long time ago," and that was the first moment he did not interrupt me. The older man then said, "The remaining instruction is procedural," and he gestured slightly toward the elevator, not as an escape, but as a transition, and I realized then that nothing further needed to be argued, because everything that mattered had already been recorded in the presence of witnesses who could no longer unsee it. I took a step back from the center of the rooftop, not dramatically, not emotionally, just naturally, like someone finally stepping out of a space that no longer required their participation, and I noticed how the sound of the city below felt closer than the voices behind me, as if New York itself had resumed speaking now that the room had finished breaking. Jason called my name once more, but it no longer carried command, only recognition of distance, and I stopped briefly, not to respond, but to understand that I no longer needed to translate myself through him. Brianna remained silent, no longer positioned beside him, no longer positioned anywhere clearly at all, and I saw in her expression something that resembled the beginning of separation from a narrative she had not authored. The lawyer held the elevator door open, and the older man gave a slight nod, not of approval, but of completion, and as I stepped forward, I felt no victory, no retaliation, only a strange quietness that came from no longer being required to stay inside a system that defined me through other people's assumptions. Jason's final words followed me as I moved away, not angry anymore but hollow, saying, "You cannot just end this like this." And I did not turn back when I answered, "I did not end anything. I simply stopped remaining where I was already gone," and then the elevator doors began to close, not sealing me away, but separating me from a version of life that no longer had instructions for my presence. The elevator doors closed slowly, not like an ending, but like a final acknowledgement that something irreversible had already finished unfolding behind me, and as I descended away from the rooftop lights of Manhattan, I could feel the sound of that room fading into something distant, almost unreal, as if I had stepped out of a version of my life that no longer had permission to define me. The silence inside the elevator was not empty, it was structured, and for the first time that night I noticed my own breathing again, steady, controlled, unfamiliar in its calmness. When the doors opened at the lobby, the city outside did not feel different, but I did, as if New York itself had not changed, only my position inside it had shifted. Behind me, the legal representative and the older man followed at a respectful distance, not guiding me, not controlling me, only confirming my exit from a space that had already stopped belonging to me in ways no one on that rooftop had fully understood yet. Jason did not follow immediately. I did not expect him to. When I finally stepped outside onto the sidewalk, the air was cooler than I remembered, and the city lights reflected off the pavement like fragments of something that had broken but was still shining. A car was already waiting, black, understated, with no markings that suggested importance, and as I stood there for a moment before entering, I felt something I had not felt in years. Not loss, not anger, but the absence of needing to be understood by people who refused to see me clearly. The door closed behind me, and the car moved forward into the city, and only then did I realize how quiet my name had become in my own mind. In the days that followed, nothing about Jason's world collapsed loudly. It unraveled in ways that did not require my involvement. Calls were not returned as quickly. Invitations became uncertain. Conversations that once centered him began to drift toward questions he could no longer answer with confidence. People were not angry. They were simply recalibrating. Brianna disappeared from the narrative as quickly as she had entered it, not with scandal but with distance, because systems that depend on perception do not survive instability for long. Jason tried to explain, of course, tried to frame what had happened as misunderstanding, but explanations do not hold weight when structure has already shifted beneath them, and I did not watch it closely. I did not need to. What mattered no longer required my attention to continue. I stayed in New York, but not in the version of it I had been orbiting before. My life did not become larger, it became quieter. I began meeting people who did not need me to shrink in order to feel secure. I returned to work that did not require emotional translation to be understood. I walked through Central Park in the mornings without checking if I was being observed correctly, and slowly, almost without noticing, my life stopped being a reaction to someone else's expectations. There was one afternoon, weeks later, when I met the older man again briefly at a small cafe near Madison Avenue. He did not speak about the past night immediately. He simply said, "Your father would have been satisfied with how you carried yourself." And I remember replying, "I did not carry anything, I just stopped resisting." And he nodded like that answer made more sense than any dramatic explanation could have. Jason became a quieter figure in my memory over time, not erased, not hated, simply understood in a different context, as someone who had once defined my place in a life I no longer inhabited. There is a strange peace in realizing that not every story needs confrontation to end. Some stories simply lose their audience, and in that absence of attention, truth becomes lighter. If you are listening to this, and you recognize even a small part of yourself in it, I want you to understand something gently, without pressure, without instruction. You do not have to wait for everything to collapse in order to reclaim your own clarity. Sometimes the first step is simply noticing where you have been quietly disappearing, and if this story reached you in a place you do not often speak about, I want you to know you are not unseen in it. There are more people than you think who have sat in rooms where they felt invisible while still being present, and there is nothing wrong with you for wanting to be recognized without having to fight for it. Thank you for staying with me through this story, not because it needed attention, but because attention itself can sometimes be a form of understanding. If you feel moved to do so, you can share your thoughts below, or simply reflect in your own way on what you are learning about your own boundaries, your own voice, your own sense of worth. And if there is one thing I would leave you with, it is this: self-recognition is not something other people grant you, it is something you stop waiting for them to deny. Thank you for being here truly, quietly, and with presence that matters more than words can fully hold.